63 years on this earth, and I had never once been made to feel invisible by someone who shared my blood. Not by the foreman at the freezing works in Invercargill who told me I'd never amount to anything more than a pair of rubber boots and a gutting knife. Not by the bank manager in Christchurch who turned down my first business loan with the particular smugness of a man who has never risked anything in his life. Not by my ex-wife Diane, who left me for a man who owned a boat and used words like curated when describing his wine collection. Not by the arthritis specialist who told me at 54 that my hands would never be what they were, which was something I already knew and didn't need a man in a white coat to confirm. Not by any of them. Not once. Not in 63 years. Until my son. Until Daniel. Welcome back to Silver Verdict. Grab yourself a cup of tea, find a comfortable chair, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the decent thing. They simply chose otherwise. Leave a comment below, and make sure you're subscribed. You'll want to be here for this one. The dinner was Daniel's idea. Of course it was. Daniel Whitmore, my son, my only child, my greatest pride and my most bewildering disappointment, had organized a fundraising dinner for his foundation at the Harbor Club in Auckland. One of those venues on the waterfront where the view does all the work, and the staff are trained to make you feel slightly underdressed regardless of what you're wearing. 150 guests. Black tie. 3 courses. The works. He'd called me 4 weeks earlier, voice bright, with the particular enthusiasm he reserved for things that required something from me. Dad, you have to come. It's a big night. I need family there. I should have recognized that for what it was. Daniel didn't need family. Daniel needed a backdrop. But he was my son. So I pressed my good jacket, the dark gray one my late mother always said made me look respectable, polished my shoes, and took the bus from my flat in Dunedin up to Auckland because I still refused to pay for last-minute airfares on principle, and because 22 hours on a bus gives a man time to think. I arrived at the Harbor Club at 7 o'clock on a Saturday evening, feeling, if not exactly celebrated, at least present. The room was genuinely impressive. I'll give Daniel that much. Floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over the Waitemata Harbor, the lights of the North Shore reflected on the water. A string quartet playing something quiet and European in the corner. 150 of Auckland's most self-satisfied citizens circling each other with champagne glasses and the practiced warmth of people who have confused donating money with being good. I found my seat. Table 12. Near the back. Beside the service corridor. I introduced myself to the people around me, a retired teacher from Hamilton, a couple from Tauranga, who raised sheep and looked slightly bewildered by the room. A woman named Margaret who kept glancing at the door as though she was expecting someone more interesting to arrive. Good people. My kind of people. Daniel found me during drinks. He shook my hand, like I was a business acquaintance he vaguely recognized and said, "Dad. Good. You made it. You look well." Before someone touched his elbow and pulled him into a more important conversation. Before I could respond, I raised this man. I drove him to school every morning for 12 years in a car with a heater that only worked on the passenger side, so he was always warm and I was always not. I sat in hospital corridors when he broke his collarbone at 14, lying through my teeth that it wasn't serious when I was terrified it was. I co-signed his first lease. I flew to Wellington when his first relationship ended badly, and he rang me at midnight not knowing what to do with himself. I worked weekends for 3 years running so he could finish his degree without debt, and he shook my hand. I had a glass of wine. Then another. Ate the bread rolls, because I am 63 years old, and I have earned the right to eat the bread without consulting anyone. Listened to 2 speakers discuss youth development programs in South Auckland, which was genuinely moving, and made me briefly forget that I was sitting at table 12 like an afterthought in my own son's story. Then Daniel took the stage. He looked extraordinary up there. Tall, easy in his tuxedo. The particular confidence of a man who has learned that rooms respond to certainty. He got that quality from me. Actually, though I doubted he'd acknowledged that to himself in quite some time, the crowd warmed to him immediately. He made a joke about Auckland traffic that landed well. He spoke about his foundation's work with real feeling, and something in my chest loosened. Perhaps I'd been too hard on him. Perhaps this was the Daniel I'd raised. Perhaps. Now, Daniel said, grinning at the room with the expression of a man about to deliver something he'd been rehearsing. We're going to do something a little different. The room leaned forward. How many of you grew up with a dad who was just a bit ordinary? Laughter, hands raised. The kind of dad who thought a Saturday at Mitre 10 counted as an adventure? More laughter. I smiled at the centerpiece on the table in front of me, the practiced smile of a man who has learned to hold his face very still when something is costing him. Well, Daniel said, I brought mine tonight. He pointed at me. 150 heads swiveled toward table 12. Stand up, Dad. I stood. Because what else do you do when your son is holding a microphone and a room full of strangers is looking at you? Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Graham Whitmore. Retired. Dunedin. Spent 30 years fixing other people's plumbing. Thinks the Antiques Roadshow is appointment television. Once described a trip to the hardware store as Daniel paused, performing the memory a pretty good afternoon, actually. The room laughed. Warm, comfortable laughter. The kind that doesn't know it has edges. I stood at table 12, and I smiled. 63 years had taught me that sometimes smiling is the only form of dignity still available to you. I smiled the way you smile when something is extracting something from you that you cannot afford to show being extracted. So here's what we're going to do, Daniel continued, eyes shining with the performance of it. We're going to auction off dinner for two with my dad. A quiet meal with an ordinary man. Who wants to take Graham Whitmore to dinner? Scattered laughter. We'll start the bidding at $1. Honestly, he paused for timing, landing the joke. I thought that was fair. The room broke open with laughter. Someone at one of the front tables shouted, $1, and people cheered. Daniel pointed at them like a game show host who had found his calling. $1. Do I hear two? Silence. More laughter. I was still standing, still smiling, and somewhere beneath the jacket my late mother always said made me look respectable. Something very old and very patient was making a decision about itself. Going once, Daniel said cheerfully. Going, and then it came. From the far side of the room, near the window, overlooking the harbor, a table I had noticed earlier because it held only one person. A woman in her mid-60s. Silver hair cut short and severe. A dark jacket. The stillness of someone who had not once in the evening looked at her phone. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. $50,000. The room didn't just go quiet. It stopped. 150 people, mid-breath, mid-sip, mid-laugh, stopped. The string quartet, who had been quietly packing up near the back wall, stopped. I'm reasonably certain the harbor itself paused outside the glass. Daniel's grin stayed on his face for a moment longer than his face wanted it to. I watched his expression do the arithmetic, in real time the smile trying to hold its shape while everything underneath it recalculated. I'm sorry, Daniel said into the microphone, his voice doing something I had never heard it do before. Did someone just $50,000? The woman said again. Same volume, same tone. The voice of someone who was not accustomed to being asked to repeat herself and was doing so only because she had decided to be generous about it. She was already standing. Silver hair, dark jacket, no jewelry worth noticing. Late 60s, perhaps. The kind of woman who takes up the precise amount of space she needs, and not 1 centimeter more, which somehow makes every eye in the room find her immediately. She was looking not at Daniel, but at me. I did not know who she was. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I, Graham Whitmore, 63 years old, standing at table 12 in my good gray jacket, had no idea who this woman was or why she had just bid $50,000 for dinner with a retired plumber from Dunedin. But she looked at me across that room full of laughing people, and something passed between us that I could not name then and still find difficult to describe. The particular recognition between two people who have spent long portions of their lives being looked past and have become very, very patient about it. Daniel recovered. Barely. We have $50,000, he said into the microphone. His voice had entirely lost its game show quality. Sold to the lady at the window table. I sat down. Margaret, who had been checking the door all evening for someone more interesting, was now looking at me as though she'd made a significant error in her initial assessment. The couple from Tauranga were leaning toward each other, whispering. The retired teacher from Hamilton looked like she might start applauding. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow sip. 63 years, I thought, and I am now very, very curious. The evening continued in a different register entirely. The easy warmth of the room had been replaced by something more charged, more uncertain. People kept glancing between me and the window table. Daniel delivered the rest of his program with noticeably less swagger than he'd started with. I noticed. I said nothing. After the formal proceedings ended and guests began drifting toward each other in the bar, the silver-haired woman crossed the room toward table 12. The crowd gave way for her without quite realizing they were doing it a particular quality of presence that cannot be learned from any course or book. She stopped beside my chair and looked down at me. Graham Whitmore, she said. Not a question. That's right, I said. She extended her hand. Vivienne Thorn. I shook it, and even in the noise of that room, I felt the name settle somewhere significant, because even in Dunedin, even a 63-year-old retired plumber who watches the Antiques Roadshow and considers a hardware run a reasonable Saturday, even I knew that name. Vivienne Thorn, founder of Thorwater Group. Infrastructure investment, water systems, rural development across New Zealand, Australia, and increasingly Southeast Asia. The kind of company that didn't advertise because the people who needed to know about it already did. That Vivienne Thorn. I believe we have a dinner to organize, she said. It appears so, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. Just slightly. My assistant will call you in the morning. She handed me a card. Plain white. Her name. A number. And walked back through the crowd, which continued parting for her without quite realizing it. I looked at the card. Then I looked across the room at Daniel, who was watching me from beside the stage with an expression I had never seen on my son's face. Not embarrassment. Not confusion. Something deeper than both. The expression of a man who has just realized he may have fundamentally misread something important. Good, I thought. Sit with that a while. I took the bus to my hotel, sat on the edge of the bed, turned the card over in my hands, and I thought, what on earth does Vivienne Thorn want with a retired plumber from Dunedin? I didn't know yet, but I had the distinct feeling I was about to find out. Vivienne Thorn's assistant rang at 8 the following morning. His name was Callum. He had the composed, pleasantly efficient energy of someone who had spent several years being very good at managing access to someone very important. We arranged lunch for the following Thursday, a restaurant near the viaduct that he named, without providing the address. As though anyone who needed the address probably wasn't the right sort of person to be going there. I wore the gray jacket again. Vivienne was already seated when I arrived. Same dark jacket, same composed stillness. She stood when I approached and shook my hand with the directness of someone who had decided a long time ago that ceremony was largely a waste of everyone's time. Graham. Vivienne. Vincent. Coffee arrived without either of us requesting it. I decided at once that I liked the place. "I'll be direct," she said. "I don't see much point in the other approach." "Neither do I," I said. She studied me for a moment with the focused attention of someone who evaluates quickly and accurately and has learned to trust that. Then she said, "I'm going to start with a name, Robert Paretta." I set down my cup. I had not heard that name spoken out loud in 9 years. Robert Paretta. My oldest friend. We'd met in our first week of trade school in Christchurch in 1982, two 18-year-olds who knew nothing about plumbing or the world, equally convinced they were going to figure out both. He was from a large family in Tautahi, sharp and funny and quietly ferocious in his ambitions. We'd worked together for 6 years after qualifying, sharing a van and a business name and most of our sandwiches, before life and geography had slowly pulled us to different places without either of us quite deciding to let the friendship go. 22 years ago, Robert had rung me from a payphone in Napier. This was before mobile phones were something everyone carried, and asked if we could meet. He drove down to Dunedin in a car that sounded worried the whole journey and sat across from me in my kitchen with a notebook full of calculations and the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and needs somewhere to put it down. "I've got a chance at something real, Gray," he said. He always called me Gray. "There's a contract going water systems for a coastal development in Marlborough. It's too big for me alone. I've got the knowledge, I've got the contacts, I've got everything except the equipment deposit, $40,000. I've been to every bank, and a few that technically aren't banks. Nobody'll touch it." I looked at the notebook. I looked at Robert. 30 years I'd known this man. He had never in 30 years told me anything that wasn't true, even when the truth was something I would have preferred not to hear. I gave him the $40,000, quietly. No paperwork, no formal agreement, no interest discussed. Just a bank transfer and a handshake in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while the kettle was boiling. My then-wife Patricia, who I was still married to at that point, would have had significant and not unreasonable things to say about this, which is why I didn't tell her until 2 years later when it no longer seemed relevant. Robert got the Marlborough contract. Then another, in Nelson. Then a larger one, in the Waikato. By the time he sold his company 15 years ago in a transaction that apparently made the business pages of the New Zealand Herald, I didn't read the business pages. He employed over 100 people and had built water infrastructure that served tens of thousands of rural New Zealand households. He'd tried to repay me a dozen times over the years. I'd declined every time, not because I'd forgotten and not entirely out of stubbornness, though stubbornness was certainly present. What I'd given Robert wasn't a loan. It was a bet on a friend, and I had never once needed the world to know I'd made it, or that it had come right. "Robert told me about you 18 months ago," Vivienne said. "We were at a hui in Wellington. He's on our advisory board. Afterwards, over dinner, he told me about a man who had handed him $40,000 in 1996 on nothing more than friendship and instinct, and had turned down every attempt at repayment for the next 20 years. She looked at me steadily. He made me promise that if I ever encountered a situation where that story was relevant, I'd tell it properly. Robert always did talk, I said. He told me, Vivienne continued, that you were the reason his company existed, that without those $40,000 and the 6 months of runway they bought him, none of it would have followed. He also told me that you had never once, in all the years since, suggested that was true. A pause. He said you were the quietest, powerful person he'd ever met. I looked at my coffee. What exactly are you offering, Vivienne? I said. She slid a folder across the table. Thorwater is expanding into a new infrastructure fund, rural water resilience projects, across the North Island and the top of the South. We're at the early investor stage. Robert is our lead advisor. He made it a condition of his involvement, not a request. A condition that we locate you and offer you a stake. I didn't open the folder yet. Why the dinner? I said. You had Robert. You could have rung me. You didn't need to bid $50,000 in a room full of people. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. She looked at her cup, then back at me. Because, she said finally, your son put you on a stage and handed a room full of people permission to laugh at you. And I watched you stand there and absorb every second of it with more composure than I have seen from anyone, in any room, in 40 years of business. She held my gaze. I thought Robert was overstating things, the way people do when they're fond of someone. He wasn't overstating things. Another pause. And I wanted your son to see that the man he'd just made into a punchline had someone in that room who knew exactly who he was. I was quiet for a moment. Open the folder, Graham, she said. I opened it. I won't tell you the specific figure on the first page. What I will tell you is that it was the kind of number that makes a 63-year-old man from Dunedin sit very, very still in a restaurant with no prices on the menu and have a thorough reconsideration of every quiet decision he'd ever made. I closed the folder. I need to think about it, I said. Of course, Vivienne said, and I'd like to understand the structure properly. I'll need to speak to my accountant. Callum will send you the full documentation this afternoon. I nodded. Then I said, 1. Condition. She waited. My son has been trying to arrange a conversation with Thorwater's investment team for about 18 months. I know this because he mentioned it at Christmas, and again at Easter, and once at a Sunday phone call in a way that was clearly not casual. I looked at her directly. I don't want you to take that meeting. Not yet. And I want him to understand why. Vivienne Thorn looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, and I could hear something in her voice that sat somewhere between admiration and quiet satisfaction. Yes, I think that can be arranged. I rang my accountant that evening. His name is Kevin. He is a careful, measured man who has managed my modest finances for 15 years and who has never in all that time said anything that could be described as enthusiastic. Kevin said, Graham, say yes. Please. I called Vivienne the following morning. I'll do it, I said. 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in early autumn, I put on the gray jacket for the third time. It was becoming something of a lucky garment. Patricia would have found that funny, given how much she'd always disliked it. Daniel had called me the previous Sunday. Easy voice. The voice he used when he was trying to extract something without appearing to be doing so. We'd spoken about nothing in particular for 10 minutes, the weather in Auckland, a documentary he'd watched, a restaurant he'd been to, and then, sliding it in so smoothly he must have rehearsed it. Hey, Dad. This is probably a long shot, but you don't happen to know anyone connected to Thorwater Group, do you? Vivienne Thorn's outfit. I've been trying to get a conversation with their investment people for over a year, and I'm not getting anywhere. Can't think of anyone, I said pleasantly. Right. Yeah. Worth asking. A pause. We should catch up properly soon. Maybe I could come down to Dunedin. That'd be nice, I said. Not anger. Whatever anger I'd felt had dissolved somewhere between that Thursday lunch and Kevin saying words he had never said before. What I felt now was something more considered than anger. The specific, deliberate patience of a man who has been quiet for 6 decades and has chosen very carefully to speak. Vivienne had arranged the meeting with the precision of someone who understands that the construction of a moment matters as much as the moment itself. Daniel had been corresponding with a member of Thorwater's business development team for 3 weeks, enough engagement to make him hopeful, enough distance to make him uncertain, enough prestige attached to the name to make him bring 2 of his foundation's board members and apparently spend the morning of the meeting changing his shirt twice. I learned this detail from his assistant, a young woman named Priya, whom I had met briefly at Christmas, and who had sent me a text that morning that said simply, "He's nervous. He ironed his trousers last night. I haven't seen him iron anything in 2 years." I arrived at Thorwater's offices in the Britomart precinct at 9:15, the kind of building that makes you feel the city rearranged itself around it. Callum met me at the lift and walked me to a small room adjacent to the main meeting room, with a view of the street below and a very good cup of tea waiting on the table. "Mr. Whitmore," Callum said, and then paused. "Miss Thorn briefed me on what this meeting is about." He allowed himself the smallest, most contained smile I'd ever seen on a professional face. In 11 years working for her, I have never seen her look forward to something this much. He closed the door quietly behind him. I sat with my tea and listened. Daniel arrived at 9:30. I heard him in the corridor, warm, performance-ready. The particular voice he deployed when he needed something from someone important. The voice I recognized from school prize givings and job interviews, and every occasion when he understood that the room required something from him. This space is extraordinary. Really. What Thorwater has built, particularly the rural resilience work, it's genuinely inspiring. He was already complimenting the building before he'd properly entered the meeting. I raised this man, I thought. I built the version of him that knew how to walk into a room. The meeting began. Vivienne's voice through the wall measured, genuinely curious, asking Daniel substantive questions about his foundation's work, its reach, its funding model, what gaps it was trying to close. Daniel answered well. "I want to be honest about that. My son is genuinely talented." He spoke about youth development in South Auckland with real intelligence and authentic feeling, and I felt the familiar, complicated pride. The pride that lives right alongside the grief of being misunderstood by the person you're most proud of. 25 minutes in, Vivienne said, "Before we continue, there's someone I'd like to bring in. He's been involved in our fund from the beginning, and I think his perspective here would be valuable." A pause. "Of course," Daniel said. Something in his voice recalibrated slightly. A small uncertainty entering. The professional warmth adjusting to accommodate the unexpected. Callum opened the door to my room and nodded at me. I stood, straightened my jacket, picked up my briefcase, the old brown leather one Daniel had always said looked like something from a garage sale, which I'd been carrying for 18 years because it had been everywhere with me. And I saw no reason to replace something that still worked perfectly well. I walked into the meeting room. What happened to Daniel Whitmore's face in the 3 seconds that followed is something I will carry with me for a very long time, and I intend to live considerably longer for the specific purpose of carrying it. First, recognition. That's my father. Then, confusion. Why is my father here? Then, the arithmetic beginning. A Thorwater partner knows my father. My father knows Vivienne Thorn. My father, who said he couldn't think of anyone. And then the fourth expression, the one underneath all the others. The one a composed and practiced man tries to suppress and cannot quite manage. The slow, stomach-shifting understanding that something has been happening that he didn't know about. That the ground beneath him was not what he believed it to be. "Dad," Daniel said. The word came out at about half the volume he intended. "Daniel," I said, the way I'd said it every Sunday for 35 years. Pleasantly, without drama. I sat down across from my son. Vivienne sat at the head of the table. Then the door opened one more time, and Robert Parada walked in, my oldest friend, the man I hadn't seen in 9 years, who had flown up from Christchurch the previous evening, and who had hugged me in Callum's corridor for a long, wordless moment that said everything that needed to be said between two old men who had watched each other become who they were going to be. Robert sat beside Vivienne and looked at Daniel with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had built something real from nothing and remembered clearly what nothing felt like. Daniel looked at Robert. I watched him recognize the name. I watched him understand who he was looking at. I watched him begin. slowly and painfully, like someone turning a map around and finally seeing which way is north to understand the shape of what he was looking at. "Daniel," Vivienne said, folding her hands on the table, "I want to be transparent with you, because I think transparency is owed here, and because I believe you deserve to understand the full picture of what this meeting is." Daniel nodded. The performance had left his face entirely. What remained was just my son, 34 years old, suddenly looking younger. "Your father and I are partners," Vivienne said. "He holds an equity stake in Thorwater's Rural Infrastructure Fund. That partnership was established 6 weeks ago." She paused. "It exists because of a decision your father made 28 years ago. A decision I won't describe in detail unless he chooses to. What I will tell you is that it is the foundational reason this fund is structured the way it is. That is not a word I use loosely." Silence. Daniel turned to look at me. "Let her finish," I said, quietly, but firmly enough. "I've also been aware of your outreach to our investment team for over a year," Vivienne continued. "I made the decision not to take that meeting. I want you to understand why. Because I think you've earned that explanation." Daniel was very still. His 2 board members, whom I had been introduced to for approximately 90 seconds, had acquired the particular frozen quality of people who have realized they are witnessing something private and can see no polite exit. "The night I met your father," Vivienne said, "I watched a 63-year-old man be stood up in front of a room full of strangers by his own son and made into the evening's entertainment. And I watched him absorb every second of it, every laugh, every pointed finger, every joke at his expense, with more dignity and composure than I have seen any person display in 4 decades of professional life." Her voice remained entirely level. It never needed to rise. "I don't do business with people who cannot recognize the value of what is directly in front of them. That is not a guideline I apply selectively." The room was so quiet I could hear the street 40 floors below. Robert was looking at the table. His jaw was moving slightly, the way it always had when he was trying not to say something. Daniel's eyes were full. My son, who could perform anything, was not performing now. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "Dad," just that word. Everything else stripped away. "I know," I said. "I didn't. It was meant to be." He stopped. "I thought it would be funny." "I know you did." "I wasn't trying to." He stopped again. I leaned forward, looked at my son the way I used to when he was small and frightened and needed someone to tell him clearly what things actually were. "Daniel, I need you to hear this, the way I mean it, not the way it might sound." He waited. "I have never needed the world to know what I do quietly," I said. "I didn't lend Robert that money because I wanted to be remembered for it. I've spent 28 years turning down repayment not because I was stubborn, not entirely because I was stubborn, but because what I gave him wasn't a debt. It was a decision about who I wanted to be, about what I thought friendship meant." I held his eyes. "I don't need recognition. I never have. But I am 63 years old, and I stood at table 12, and 150 people laughed, and you pointed at me, and called me ordinary in front of strangers, and it cost me something. I am not going to pretend it didn't." Daniel's jaw was tight. His eyes were full. "So here is what is going to happen," I said. I stood, buttoned my jacket, picked up my briefcase, the old one, the garage sale one, the one that had been with me for 18 years. "I am going to go home to Dunedin. I am going to find something at Mitre 10 that is genuinely interesting, and you are going to sit with this." I looked at him steadily, not with anger, because the anger had long ago finished burning, not as punishment, as information about who your father actually is, about what quiet looks like when it has been paying attention. I looked at his board members briefly, acknowledged them with a nod. "Your foundation is doing real work, Daniel. Keep doing it." I straightened my cuffs. Then I reached across the table and put my hand on my son's shoulder firmly, briefly, the way a father does when he loves someone completely and is also deeply disappointed in them and doesn't have adequate language for both at the same time. I shook Vivienne's hand. Then I turned to Robert and hugged him properly, the kind of hug that doesn't apologize for itself, the kind you give a man you've known since you were both 18 and broke, and absolutely certain the world would eventually make sense. 40 years, Robert said quietly. 40 years, I said. I let go, picked up my briefcase, walked to the door. Graham, Vivienne said. I turned. She was looking at me with the expression I had first seen at a window table in the Harbor Club when she had looked across a room full of laughing people and found me. Quiet regard. The kind that does not require an audience. Dinner, she said. Whenever you're next in Auckland, only if it's somewhere without a dress code, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. Obviously. I walked out. I took the lift down, walked through the lobby, and pushed out into the Britomart morning. Auckland received me the way it always does. Loudly, indifferently, completely unconcerned with the private seismic events of any individual human life. I stood on the footpath for a moment and let the noise and the cold autumn air and the particular smell of the city wash over me. In my inside jacket pocket was a document my accountant had described, with visible effort at restraint, as genuinely life-changing. A stake in a water infrastructure fund that Vivienne Thorn had spent 4 years building carefully and quietly into something that would, over the coming decade, reshape how rural New Zealand thought about water resilience. My name on it. Graham Whitmore. Dunedin. Retired plumber. Ordinary. Daniel would rebuild. I know my son. He is stubborn and capable, and underneath all the performance, underneath the gala and the microphone and the pointing, underneath the Saturday morning voice he uses to extract things he needs, he is the boy I drove to school every morning, in a car, with a broken heater. The boy I sat beside in hospital corridors. The boy who rang me at midnight from Wellington, with nothing left but the sound of his own voice. He would sit with what had happened in that room. He would turn it over. He would eventually, not soon, but eventually, in the way that slow and necessary things happen, understand it, the way it needed to be understood. And when he was ready, I would be in Dunedin, where I have always been. I walked to the bus stop, went home to Dunedin, made a cup of tea, sat in my kitchen, and for the first time since a Saturday evening on the Auckland waterfront, when my own son held up a microphone and offered me to a room full of strangers for $1, Graham Whitmore felt exactly, entirely, and without any qualification, like himself. Not ordinary. He was never ordinary. He was just quiet. And the thing about quiet people, the thing Daniel Whitmore was only beginning to understand, 40 floors up in a meeting room in Britomart with Robert Parada's eyes on the table and Vivienne Thorn's words still in the air, is that quiet is not the same as small. Quiet people watch carefully. Quiet people remember everything. Quiet people build slowly and without announcement, and what they build tends to last. And when quiet people finally decide the moment has arrived, when they button their jacket and pick up their old leather briefcase and walk out of a room they have just rearranged completely, they don't look back. They don't need to. There is an old saying that the tree which bends in the storm survives, while the one that refuses to bend does not. Dignity is not loudness. Strength is not performance. And a life built on loyalty, on keeping your word, on showing up quietly and without fanfare for the people you love, that life does not disappear simply because someone fails to notice it. It accumulates, it deepens, and one day, in a room you didn't expect, before people you've never met, it speaks for itself more clearly than any announcement ever could. If there is a lesson worth carrying from a story like this, it is simply this: do good things quietly and without keeping score. Not because the world will eventually reward you for it, it may not. And that should not be the reason. Do it because it is the correct way to move through a life. Because the person across the table from you in a diner or a kitchen or a bus shelter may be carrying something that your belief in them, just your belief, nothing more could make possible. And because 60 years from now, or 20, or 9, that quiet decision may be the truest thing anyone ever says about who you were. If this story meant something to you, please consider leaving a comment below. I genuinely read every one. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Silver Verdict. There are more stories coming, real ones, the kind worth sitting down for.